Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our 6th online taster seminar. And this is also the last in our series. My name is Sascha Stollhans, and I'm the outreach officer here in the Department of Languages and Cultures at Lancaster University. And just a few words of housekeeping before we start. If we could please ask you to switch off your cameras and your microphones, as that will really help improve the quality of the meeting for everyone. We would love to hear your questions and your comments and your thoughts though. So if you could please write any questions you have in the chat. And my colleague Chris Witter will be monitoring the chat, and he will be putting all your questions to the speakers at the end. Please also note that we're recording this seminar, and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel this afternoon, so you can watch it again and share it with friends and family if you like. And our YouTube channel is Languages and Cultures at Lancaster University. Great. So the previous 5 taster seminars, we focused on specific languages and cultures, and we thought for this final one, it would be quite interesting to look at translation and interpreting. So rather than looking at specific cultures and languages, to look at a really important and interesting topic that affects all languages. Now, here at Lancaster, we have an MA program in translation, and translation is also an integral part of all our undergraduate degrees. So all our students, bachelor and master students, they will sort of like work with translation and to an extent with interpreting at some point during their studies. And what we're going to do today is there are 2 parts to this seminar. The first part will be 3 very short, very brief introductory presentations by some of our academics who teach translation and interpreting here at Lancaster. So we've got Dr. Erika Fülöp, who will start, and Erika is also the director of our MA in translation. And Erika will look at well, she called her presentation Translation, a Search for Equivalence. So she will look at this question of translatability and what does equivalence actually mean. Afterwards, I will briefly look at translation software and machine translation and just highlight a few key issues in that area. And finally, my colleague Romain Bardot will look at interpreting and give a brief introduction to interpreting. And then in the second part of the seminar, which I think is really exciting, we're going to have a conversation with some of our current and former students. So we've got Lucy Trendell, one of our BA students in German Studies and Spanish Studies. And Lucy has written her undergraduate dissertation on translating children's literature, and that's really exciting. And we've got Chris Ellison, one of our MA students, and he'll be able to tell us a bit about his experience with both translation and interpreting during his studies. And then we are really pleased to welcome back Amelia Hill, who is one of our graduates. Amelia completed both her undergraduate and her MA studies with us and graduated from her MA program last year. And she now works as a professional translator, and so she can tell us a bit about life as a professional translator. Great. So you can see that's quite a packed program. So we've kind of extended this session to 90 minutes. So we're going to finish at 1:30. But obviously, I appreciate it was advertised initially as a 1-hour session. So if you have to leave at 1, that's completely fine. And we will share the recording on our YouTube channel anyway. So yes, so please do ask all your questions in the chat and make any comments. And without further ado, I will pass over to Erika to make a start.
Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Sascha, if you can just make a sign that microphone is working all right?
Yeah, we can hear and see you perfectly.
Okay, great. So I have taken control of the PowerPoint, so that should be fine. So I will start this session by talking a little bit about translation theory, or one of the most important questions that have been asked in the history of translation studies and history of translation, is what equivalence means and how we find it, or what its relation to translation is. So if we could just, oops, flipping, right. So if you could just give a quick thought to how you would define translation. If we were in an actual seminar, I would like to have a discussion about this. But for now, just to get you into the thinking about this, try to phrase a sentence in your mind about what you would call translation, how you would define it. I'll give you a few seconds for thinking there. And I cannot check all your answers, which would be much more interesting, but I would bet a quite high sum on that you will have something similar to this definition proposed by an important theorist in the 60s, John Catford, who defined translation as the replacement of textual material in one language by equivalent textual material in another language. So even if you didn't use exactly those terms, it's a fairly common sense definition and approach to translation to define it as something like finding the same meaning or the same message in one language that will render the meaning of an original message in the source text. So somehow equivalence or sameness or similarity will most likely play some role in your definition, right? So equivalence has been this key term throughout these discussions about translation. And if my definition here dates a little bit, it is because this concept and the focus on this concept in what translation is has also been much criticized in more recent years and theories. And I'll give you a sense of why this might be the case. So let's see, first of all, what equivalence is. Again, in the common sense definition, if you look at the dictionary, you will find, this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, equivalent would be equals with something else in value, amount, function, meaning, etc. So that etc. is not at all innocent there. But then you could say something like 1 is a number, 2 is a number, they are both numbers, therefore 1 equals 2. There's something wrong with it, right? Because 1 is a number, 2 is a number, they are equal in function, but still they are not exactly the same. They are not equivalent, right? And so there is another definition to what equal means, being the same in quantity, size, degree, or value, right? 1 and 2 might be both numbers, might have the same function in an equation, but they are not equivalent in size or value. So the question immediately emerges as to what do we mean by finding an equivalent in a target language to something that exists in our source language, right? So a seemingly simple definition explodes immediately. So what are we looking at when we are speaking about translation and finding equivalence from one language to another? The two key directions that are also often mentioned in looking for equivalence is a word-for-word translation, or what is also called literal translation. This is how you probably start when you're first looking at the text that is to be translated. You look at what the words mean and try to find their equivalent, or their equivalence in the other language. And the other direction or method that is often distinguished from it is sense-for-sense translation. But the question then arises as to what we mean by sense. What sense? Sense in what sense, right? So as soon as you start scraping a little bit the surface, it becomes clear that it is not so simple a question, because you can look at what the dictionary says, as I just did with equivalence, what is also called denotation, the first meaning of the term, which might already be more than one thing, right? So you need to look at the context, which meaning we are looking at. But it can also be something that we associate with the word. In literature, often it's not the first meaning that matters in a text, in a poem, if you think of that, but the connotation, the feelings it might make emerge, or the cultural associations with the term. So again, what sense are we looking at when we're looking at the equivalence? You can also wonder what the author might have meant with a word, which might not be exactly the same as either the first dictionary meaning of the term or the associations that anyone else might have. So you might look at the intentions in order to remain faithful to the text. But the question there is, of course, how can we know? With contemporary authors and often in our translation jobs, you are able to perhaps ask the author, but that's not always the case. So then we are bound to speculate a little bit. Or you might also think it's not what the author thought that is important, but what the reader might understand by the text, or what the author might think that the reader would understand with the text. But again, the question is there, which reader? Or how would we know what reader might understand what? Or so again, the question is far from being obvious. And one further complication, at which level we should look for the meaning. So even if I accept that all these questions can somehow be answered, and we are looking for a sense-for-sense translation in any of these senses, do you look at the sense of a word? Again, connotation or denotation. Do you look at a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, an entire text, or an entire oeuvre, the entire work of an author? Because the different levels might change the meaning of the text. If you think of a poem read on its own, it might be different from if you look at the whole collection of poems, which might change slightly the sense of the message, if you like. Or last but not least, you could also look at the function or purpose of a text. This might especially be important if you look at more pragmatic uses of text, such as advertisement, for instance. It might be the case that what the words mean in any sense that are listed do not achieve the purpose that was originally intended or what it was for. So you can see all the questions that equivalence raises, and it makes this search for equivalence really complicated. And to illustrate this with an example, a bit of a more concrete example, it is well known that we have cultural differences in our uses of words, and it is also well known that what you hear people saying in Britain is not exactly the same that other people would mean by the same English words. And how people would understand those words. So just some of the well-known examples, quite good, when a British person says quite good, another British person might understand that it means it's a bit disappointing. But if you are American or coming from another country who has learned English as a non-native speaker, you will understand that it is quite good. So it's actually a positive comment. So there is quite a difference between the meaning and the word, and loads of examples could be cited along the same lines. So as a translator, you will have to look at not only the context but also the cultural situation in which such conversation is happening. This also applies, of course, not only to words, but other elements in the context. I have this image here, which is the representative of the fact that things might symbolize also certain aspects of culture that are equivalent in a broader sense to other things. So if I don't know, we have a stereotype about Chinese people eating a lot of rice. And you have to translate such a situation for a German audience, the same kind of stereotype would be a sausage, for instance. So this is just a silly example, but you see what I mean about looking for cultural context and talking about stereotypes in particular. So I have a little example which you could try at home. If you'd like to play, you will have the video and you can see these slides again. So I have here one sentence in 3 languages, in French, Spanish, and German. And I'm sorry if anyone is here for Chinese, I won't have the example simply because I won't speak that language. But if you'd like to test yourself, you could try to translate the sentence into English from the language that you're learning. And see how many options you can come up with. It's a fairly simple sentence, But once you try to translate, I think you will realize it's still not so straightforward how you could translate it into English. And if you want to try this little translation exercise, I recommend that you don't look at the next slide, which I will show, because there are a number of potential solutions there. So please close your eyes a little bit if you'd like to do this later. But I had to include it so you can also see it if you would like to check. So the original sentence is the French one. And there are 4 published English translations which go in very different directions. And the trick here is that this is the first sentence of a very, very long novel, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And according to critics, the way this sentence is structured has a meaning for the entire structure of the novel. So in a way, the way you translate or the way you read the sentence can influence your entire reading and interpretation of the whole novel. So you can see the weight that is on the shoulder of the translation in a way, not only to find a word, but really to give an interpretation of the work. So translation studies would deal with all these difficulties, and the questions are raised about sense and in what sense we are looking for equivalence for a sense. They all produced various theories. But the conclusion we can draw that is that if you try to define translation in terms of equivalence or sameness, it is not at all straightforward. As you see from this very cute representation, which I think is a good summary of this whole argument, results might vary. And you as a translator, in a way, your job as a translator would be to know the options, know the various options, know their implications, and to negotiate and find the most fitting solution in a given context. And it will never be entirely the same thing. There's always translation loss and gain. But you will have to decide what is it that you want to achieve with your translation. So it's all about negotiation. And you learn translation studies also and theories also to be a better negotiator, so to speak. So that's for me. If you'll have any questions, please ask in the chat, and we can come back to it at the end of the session. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Sascha.
Great, thanks very much, Erika. So the next part of this seminar, I will look at translation software and machine translation. And of course, I can't really give you a detailed, comprehensive introduction here, but I can sort of flag up a few of the issues around this, and I can sort of like show you what kind of aspects we would be discussing with our students, especially on the MA program. So the big question when it comes to machine translation, translation software, technology in translation is, how could technology help us translate more efficiently? So it's 2020, and we are in a very technologically advanced age. So how could we use the technology that is there to help us translate more efficiently? Now, there is a very common misconception there, and I think we first need to really talk about what we are talking about here. And I would say there are at least 2 different kinds of ways in which technology supports translation. One of them is machine translation, and that is something like Google Translate. Now, I will be using Google in this presentation as an example, not because I work for Google or they pay me, or I think it's the best, but I think it's the most commonly used one and the most accessible one for anyone. So that is machine translation. So you basically ask a computer program to translate for you. The other thing is what is called CAT, or computer-assisted translation. Now, computer-assisted translation means how can we use software as human translators to help us translate more quickly, more efficiently, also more cost efficiently. So CAT tools are tools that basically help translators translate, and by extracting the text from the files that you want to translate, and I'm simplifying now, but they basically create a bilingual table for you with the source text on the left Then you can enter your text, your target text on the right. And cut tools are really, really useful because they also help you be consistent, because they save all your translations and they analyze your future translations against your previous translations to make sure that you translate them more quickly and more efficiently. Yeah? And cut tools are really the professional translator's best friends in this day and age. And obviously they're called cat tools, though. You can imagine there are lots of puns around this. Even Facebook groups, this really funny Facebook group, Translators with Cats, just as a side note. Okay, but I don't really want to talk about cat tools in this presentation. I'd like to talk about machine translation. So things like Google Translate, which we all know, we all have used. If you're a pupil, if you're a school student, you will probably hear your teachers often say, oh, don't use Google Translate for your homework, and that is right. So we all know about machine translation. We all know about Google Translate. We all either love it or hate it. But I think it's very legitimate to ask, how useful are these tools actually? How good are they these days? And sort of the question on the opposite side of the spectrum is, could they pose a threat to the translation industry and to human translators? So if Google Translate and similar tools get better and better and better and better, does that mean that at some point we won't actually need human translators anymore? So these are sort of the questions we would discuss with our students, and I'd love to hear your opinions on this. So please put them in the chat. I would love to talk to you about this later. Okay. And similar programs, they are often used in popular culture because they can produce some really funny results. I don't know if you know this. This is Jimmy Fallon, and he hosts an American late night talk show. And in this talk show, he has this feature, this element called Google Translate Songs. Google Translate Songs. And what they do is they use popular songs, they translate them into a different language, a random different language with Google, and then they translate it back into English and see what happens. And then they perform these songs on the show. And this is I Want It That Way by the Backstreet Boys. And you see the back translation resulted in I Desire Roads. So something quite different to what the original lyrics say. And this is done for fun. Yeah? This is done for fun. But yeah, it's really common to look at Google Translate in this way in popular culture. Now, if we look at it a bit more scientifically, how good is machine translation? And again, I'm using Google Translate not because I think it's the best or the most important one, but I think because it's the most accessible one and the most well-known one. Okay, now let's try it. So what I've done is I've used an English phrase and I've put it into Google Translate to see what happens. Okay, now, as we said before, Google Translate and similar tools are often the butt of jokes, or the butt of jokes. This is obviously an English expression. It's not actually a rude expression, although we have this word but, which has several meanings in English. But in this case, it just means the target of jokes. That's, I don't know, if you speak French, it's related to the French word le but, which just means target or goal. So an idiomatic expression, Google Translate and some tools are often the butt of jokes. Now, let's say I'm a translator, or I want to translate a text that includes this phrase, the butt of jokes, into French, German, Spanish, and Chinese. I've chosen these languages because they are the languages that we currently offer on our MA. So let's see what happens. I'll ask Google for help. So this is the German translation, according to Google, der Hintern der Witze. This is the French one. This is the Spanish one. And this is the Mandarin Chinese one. Yeah. And now you can see what Google actually has done. It has translated it quite literally and has used the rather rude translation for but. So not the metaphorical one. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments at the same time, I shouldn't. But the rather rude, quite literal translation. Okay, now, does this mean Google is bad? Does this mean machine translation doesn't work and we shouldn't use it? I don't know. Maybe it just needs a bit of help from a human translator. Yeah. So what might help achieve a more accurate translation? For example, if we add a bit of context. Now, if I put in this entire sentence, Google Translate is often the butt of jokes, and you can see the translation in the same languages again, and you can see it's actually a lot better So the German one is accurate, the French one is accurate, the Spanish one looks okay to me as far as I can tell. I don't know about the Chinese one. If someone can maybe who speaks Chinese maybe can give us some feedback on this one. But definitely adding some context really, really helps. Yeah? So Google Translate is quite accurate and can even deal with these figurative, metaphorical, idiomatic expressions if you give a bit of context. Okay, but it can also lead to misunderstandings. So this is in 2008 when the German national football team was evicted from the Football World Cup. This is a tweet they tweeted on Twitter. And you can have a look at the English translation. And it's quite interesting. The German uses the word ausscheiden, ausgeschieden, which in German can have lots of different meanings, lots of really different meanings. And you can see here, Google translated it on Twitter as, therefore, we are well-deserved retirement. What it actually said is, we were evicted, we lost deservedly. So it was right that we lost because we didn't play that well. And you see, Google just chose a different word here in this context because it didn't understand the context, what's going on. But this screenshot, this is a screenshot I took a year ago. I did the same again yesterday. So have a look here at the English translation. Dear fans, we're just as disappointed as you. That's why we deservedly left, bitter as it is. It's so much better and it's really accurate. And there you can also see how Google has developed in the past year and that translations are much better these days and they continue to be better. Yeah. Okay. Another example is this sentence, which this is not a sentence I came up with. I've given you an article here from The Atlantic. It's a very interesting article. This is a sentence in English. It could be a sentence from a novel. In their house, everything comes in pairs. There's his car and her car, his towels and her towels, and his library and hers. Okay, let's translate it into French using Google. And you can see the translation is, dans leur maison, tout vient par paire. Il y a sa voiture et sa voiture, ses serviettes et ses serviettes, et sa bibliothèque et la sienne. I don't know, those of you who speak French, they will see that there's a bit of a problem with this translation, isn't there? Yeah. But the problem is that these possessive articles, his and her, they are the same in French for masculine and feminine. So a woman would get the same pronoun or the same article as a man. Sa voiture et sa voiture, his car and her car. Now, this, of course, is a problem for Google Translate because if you just look at the French sentence without context, you don't really understand what is meant here. And you can see that if you translate it back to English. So I've then used the French translation and translated it back to English in Google. And the new sentence is, in their house, everything comes in pairs. There is his car, his towels and his towels, his library and his. So you can see without context, this is really difficult. And you do really need a human translator to come up with something because that message can be communicated in French. You just need to find a different way to do it. And it's also interesting, but again, just as a side note, how Google uses the masculine pronouns as a default. So it just assumes that all the pronouns are masculine when you translate it back. Okay, so a big problem for machine translation is what we call pragmatics in linguistics. So things like hidden messages, emotional language, cultural conventions and references, irony, sarcasm, politeness conventions. Erika already mentioned earlier, it's been all over social media some time ago. It's sort of like what the British people say and what they actually mean when they say it. So this reading between the lines. Obviously, this is tongue-in-cheek, but this is something that is very difficult for machine translation to work with, understandably. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that, at least for now, we definitely do need human translators. But I think human translators and machine translators could work together very well. And this is actually what is done in lots of translation agencies these days. To save money and to save time, a method is used that is called machine translation post-editing. So that means a text, if it's been identified as suitable, is machine translated. And in many of those CAT tools that I mentioned earlier, there are now inbuilt machine translation tools. And then a human translator goes through this translation and edits it and makes sure that it's all correct. Yeah? And this is increasingly used, I would say, by agencies to save time and money because it is quicker and it could be a bit cheaper as well. And I'm really glad that Amelia Hill is here because I mentioned earlier that in the second part, we will talk to some of our graduates and current students. And Amelia has worked with machine translation post-editing quite a bit. So I'm really excited to hear her thoughts on this later. Okay, so thanks very much. That's all from me for now. And I'll pass over to Romain for interpreting.
Thank you very much, Sascha. So yeah, we'll start a bit with interpreting. Big overall question about what is interpreting, and I'd like to start with a joke that you can find on Interpreters Fora. Works for translators as well, but this question about how many interpreters does it take, to change a bulb, and the whole question of the answer, it depends on the context, and that refers very well with what Sascha and Erika were saying earlier. So a brief introduction into what is interpreting and how do people see interpreters? How do interpreters see themselves? Interpreters speak all the time. What my friends think I do. I mean, I think this meme, just taken from the internet, is a good summary of what interpreting can be seen as. I don't know if you have seen this film, The Interpreter, with Sean Penn and Nicole Kidman. It's a bit from, I think, 2005, I think. A very good film. I mean, it's very Hollywoodian, of course, but a very good film that shows a bit in a Hollywood way the world of interpreters at the UN. So it's quite good, actually, fairly accurate to an extent. We have, of course, the notions of Google Translate, but what I like is, what I think I do as an interpreter, the idea of building bridges, putting people together, okay? And what I actually do, and we can see already here the notion of presence, okay, of intercommunication between people, okay? So interpreters are just translators who speak, right? No, don't say that. I don't like it. It's of course the question between the spoken word and the written word. The spoken word gives you the idea of straight away. You have to be accurate straight away. You can't edit what you were saying. Okay, if I've just said something wrong, I might just repeat myself and correct it, but what I've said still stands. Okay, so there is that bit of pressure that is slightly different from the translator's pressure. Spoken word is also what I would call the spoken in and the spoken out. Bear with me. Spoken in, the idea of the accent, okay, or the bass of the speaker. Okay, I live in Salford, and the other day I was listening to my neighbors speaking between themselves, and I didn't understand everything. Salfordian accent, me being a French living in the UK, not used to everything. Okay, imagine now that in the interpreting environment, I will have to adapt to that. Obviously, also the pace of the speaker and the tone of the speaker, how monotonous, how very exciting he is when he speaks. They are. Spoken out as well, the idea of conveying the same message, the same intent. We've been mentioning the notion of context, of equivalence, of denotation, connotation, author's intentions. If you followed up, that's the summary keywords from Erika's and Sascha's. Well, that happens in interpreting as well, okay? The role of terminology. There is no time for research when you interpret, okay? You have to do it straight away. You have to basically be prepared for it in advance. I'm not saying translators are not prepared, okay? They are, believe me, they are. But think about these metaphors coming here, the images that comes in your head, the idioms, how you could go from one idiom to another, and maybe the worst of all, the jokes, okay? the speaker is making everyone laugh. You have to make your crew laugh. Well, it's not always easy. So as I already mentioned, there is a notion of working under pressure. And it's basically a different kinds of pressure compared to the world of translating. It's very much time related, okay? In immediacy, time is the essence. And it's also a notion of communication, contact facing. There is what you're saying, there is how you're saying it, there is the context around you, there is a pragmatic, the paralinguistic, everything coming into a shape. The interpreter is, to an extent, an actor, okay? And that's why not all translators, are good as they may be, are good interpreters, and vice versa, for that matter. Because the interpreter will focus on getting the communication across, okay? And the notion of equivalence there is slightly different, okay? There's also a great feeling of team spirit in interpreting, because you often, especially in conference interpreting, you're often not alone. So you basically work with your partners. And it can also, just passing by, leads you to interesting, to say the least, situations. If you're interpreting someone who is just insulting someone else, and how you cope with that, how you pass that message across, okay? If I'm insulting the policeman in front of me as an interpreter, speaking for the person I'm interpreting at the moment, this can, give some, put you in interesting situations there. So types of interpreting, settings. We see interpreters, as we said, as communication between people, meetings, bilateral meetings, small groups, bigger groups. There are different types. You have the idea of public service interpreting, the community. As I mentioned already, interviews with the police, in the job centers, in courts, but also in hospitals. You also have the idea of conference, business interpreting, working with companies, meetings, etc. What kind of interpreters can you be? You can be interpreting over the phone, and actually it's the one type of interpreting that is developing immensely at the moment due to the current health situation over the world. More and more interpreters are doing it as visio via Skype, etc. You have your interpreter's best friend, the notepad, especially when you do what we call consecutive interpreting, the idea of someone speaks and then you translate, and then you kind of go both ways between the speaker and the audience, for example. Okay, one common shape, if you are in bilateral, is what we call whispering. And this is something, if you when you see images of for example, head of states and governments meeting, and they just just see like there are just two of them with the cameras, etc. You often see people just behind and very close to their ears between each of them, and it's very often their interpreter being there for them to put it into their ear so that it doesn't interfere with the communication. And of course, we see it all the time. We see it on TV. We see these people interpreting as a sign language, and that's also an incredibly important part of the job. One type of interpreting I haven't mentioned yet, and perhaps the most common one, or maybe the one that people know most, because obviously it's the most spectacular one as well. It's simultaneous interpreting. And I'd like to take you on a journey of an interpreting carol in 3 acts. Simultaneous interpreting, I'll start by calling on the ghost of interpreting past. Let's take us to Nuremberg trials right after the Second World War is seen to an extent as the beginning of simultaneous interpreting, or what brought the professionalism to this new industry. This is one of the famous picture of the defense. Okay, and I'd like you to take a special look at everything circled in blue. These little headphones, these little headsets there. Okay, and now look at the red area, and you have the interpreting booth. Pretty much the first of the kinds, or some of the first of the kinds. We have here the interpreters going between the French, the German, the Russian, and the English, which were the different languages spoken at the trial. Interestingly, at that time, you can see you have 3 interpreters, often per booth, and they were grouped by target language. So you would have in the same booth all interpreters speaking into French, for example. Okay, one would go from Russian into French, one would go from German into French, one would go from English into French, and then next you would have the English booth and a German booth, etc., etc. And they basically were just sharing the microphone. Okay, so that's where it pretty much started in the late 1940s, and now we can go on and visit the ghost of interpreting present. Okay, this is how a typical interpreting booth looks like nowadays. Obviously a bit more shielded from the rest of the meeting, and that basically caters for better environment to give your interpreting performance in. You usually work as a duo, okay, and now you're normally put by combination. So you would have 2 interpreters working, for example, French, German, okay, usually both ways. And they would basically swap every 20 or 30 minutes so that you can keep the concentrations levels to the maximum. Interpreting simultaneously does a lot of things to the brain. There has been some research, and more in the past few years, neuroscientists have been very, very interested in what interpreters' brains look like when they're working. And there is this urban legend of interpreters doing crosswords whilst interpreting. So that's multitasking for you. But of course, you can't keep this concentrations level to their peak for hours on end. So it's very useful to have someone to call on to and to swap with them so that you can give your best for 20, 30 minutes, and then breathe a bit and then get back into it. Now, if you imagine, we're talking combinations, we're talking like 2 interpreters ready for French and German. Next, there will be maybe the English-German booth, etc., etc. Let's put it to the scale of the European Union or the UN, okay, with all the languages that can be spoken in the assembly. Let's say you're in Brussels or Strasbourg at the parliament, and someone is speaking in Maltese, which is absolutely fine, and I'm a Lithuanian speaker. Am I calling onto a Maltese to Lithuanian interpreter? Well, I might have one, and that would be brilliant, okay? But I'm pretty sure they're not that common, okay? So what we do in that case is we call on relay interpreting. And that is when someone from a booth connects to another booth and listens to the speech being already interpreted in one language, so that it gets then reinterpreted into the other language. So you would have, for example, the Maltese being interpreted into English, and then from English into Lithuanian. Now, I was talking about pressure earlier. So there's a pressure of you as an interpreter delivering your message within the situation of the meeting, etc. Add to that the added complication of you have someone else depending on you to get their interpreting right as well. Okay, so that's the kind of context environment you can work in as an interpreter. And now, and pretty much to wrap this off, let's call on the ghost of interpreting yet to come. This is very interesting technological evolutions of the past few years. Waverly Labs are one of these ones. That's basically one of these companies that's working on merging machine translation with interpreting. So you have here earpods and basically a smartphone app. And apparently it works. Now, I think it works as well as machine translation does, and to the same extent. And as Sascha was saying, there's so much that can be translated at the moment. But I think it's, where machine translation meets interpreting, working on the technologies of machine translation and speech recognition that have, gone through the roof lately, that's really where the future lies. I'm leaving you with a few various resources if you're interested in knowing more about interpreting, about the history interpreting, or maybe also the neuroscience type. And I'm handing it back to you, Sascha.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Excellent. Now, so we thought these three presentations could give you a bit of an overview of different issues that are currently being discussed in translation interpreting studies. And that concludes part 1 of this seminar. Now, let's come to part 2, which is a really exciting part as well. And this is the part where we are going to talk to some of our current and previous students and see how they have worked with interpreting and translation. And yeah, so Lucy, Chris, and Amelia. So I would suggest that I'll ask each of you to just briefly introduce themselves and just briefly say who you are, what you do and what you have been doing, and what your relation is with translation and interpreting. And then we can ask you a few questions, and then we can open the floor for further questions from the audience as well. Does that sound okay? Maybe I'll stop presenting so people can see our faces. Maybe we can start with Lucy. Would you like to start introducing yourself?
Yeah, hello. I'm Lucy. Do you want me to turn my camera on?
Oh, if you wouldn't mind, I think it would be great.
Yeah, of course. Hello. My name's Lucy. I'm an undergrad student at Lancaster, or I was technically, not anymore. I did German and Spanish studies, and then, like Sascha says, for my dissertation, I translated chapters 1 and 7 of a German children's book that hadn't been translated into English before. It was called Die Duftapotheke, by a German author, Anne Ruhr. She's written 6 of those books now, I think, or she's written 4 and 2 are being published later. It's been translated into Dutch, but like I say, not into English. And it was really interesting translating. I always knew that I wanted to do some sort of like fantasy, like Harry Potter or something like that for my dissertation, because the idea of translating something almost made up, like the spells and things like that from Harry Potter, into English was really interesting to me. But I didn't want to translate something that had already been translated. So I settled on just a standard German children's book. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, we really enjoyed reading your translation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. So if you have any questions for Lucy, please pop them in the chat and we'll ask her. Now, yeah, Chris, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, no worries. I'll just turn my camera on. So my name's Chris. I studied French and German for my undergraduate degree, and I'm now doing the master's course in translation at Lancaster. I've really enjoyed the course so far. In this final term, I'm working on my dissertation, so I'm translating parts of a French novel by Jean Genet, who's a sort of 20th century French writer. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions for Chris, please pop them in the chat. And Amelia.
Hi. So I'm Amelia. I graduated last year from the MA in Lancaster and currently working as a freelance translator. But not only a translator, I think my career since I graduated has been just full of variety. So do some translation, and I work with the CAT tools that you mentioned earlier. So I use mostly Trados and WordFast. And then I'm also doing a lot of proofreading. So I proofread a lot of medical documents that have been translated. And the goal of that is to get experience in the medical field to then become a medical translator. So I'm getting work whilst I'm getting the experience to become a translator, which is quite good. And I also do a lot of machine translation post-editing. So that is a big part of the work. Like you said earlier, it saves time, it saves money, both for the clients and for us translators. We can fit in more work. And then I do something else called translation annotation. So this is working with machine translations, not editing them, not correcting them, but annotating the mistakes to then teach the machine translation how to translate better. So this kind of goes into what you said before about machine translations. Does that make the translator unnecessary in the process? So I'm kind of helping the machine translations to be better, which could be quite controversial.
No, that's really fascinating. Thank you, Amelia. We'll ask you about that more in a minute, because I'd love to hear more about that. So there's a question for Lucy, and that's exactly the same question I was going to ask you as well, Lucy. So a question from Ella, who says, can you describe any particular challenges you had when translating the children's novel, and how did you resolve these problems?
The biggest thing for me was deciding, because it's a children's novel, deciding how English I was gonna make it sound. Because I did a lot of research before I even started translating it, and into like how children receive, especially English children, receive translated literature. There's not very much translated literature in circulation in the UK, and how, yeah, I did a lot of research into how we receive it, even as adults and children. And I decided eventually to move the story into England because it was set in Germany, and there was a lot of German-specific vocab and cultural references and things like that. Things like she goes to the bakery, the main character goes to the bakery at one point, and Sascha and I had a conversation about changing her order because what she ordered was very German. She ordered like pretzels and things like that. So I swapped it into an English, to be a more English order. But because of that, I then had to move the story to England. So, for example, she moves in the original story, the family. So basically, I'll give you an outline of the story. It's about a young girl whose family have just moved to this old house. It's all falling down and it smells a bit funny. And they basically find this store of like all secret potions, secret perfumes that have magical powers. But when they moved from Berlin to near the Dutch border. So, for example, I moved that from London to near the Scottish border. That was one of the biggest things for me, deciding, like coming to terms with making that decision, deciding that that was what I was going to do and rolling out the effects of it across my whole translation, and making sure it was consistent. I did a lot of research into like discussions on like colonialism and erasing the original author's intentions. And I'm very aware that if it was, for example, about the Second World War or the GDR or the Berlin Wall or something even vaguely political, I would have had to really reconsider my decision. But yeah, that I decided, because it was children's literature and I wanted to make it accessible to English readers, I would much rather that they would read something that had been very strongly domesticated than not read it at all.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember having these discussions with you because I supervised the project, and I think you made some really, really interesting and really creative choices there, also by changing some of the names to make sure that they sound more familiar to the new culture. I think that's really, really fascinating. We've had a question from Irina who said, what was the translation process like, and how long did you have to complete it?
So I decided in my end of my second year that I wanted to do a translation dissertation, which meant that I had 2 whole years to do the dissertation until it was submitted. I bought the book on my year abroad, so that was about a year before the deadline, and started translating it just because I thought, well, I'll give this a go and see if I like it, and if I don't like it, I can always start something different. But I obviously ended up using that book. It did take me about a year to do the whole thing. But then I did a lot of extra research and would do bits and then take a step back and leave it for a couple of weeks and come back to it again. So I think if I had less time, I would have been able to do it. But I definitely enjoyed having that much time to think about it and to go about it in the way that I wanted to, and to change the decisions that I'd made and decide why I wanted to do things.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. I also remember that actually the author of the book got in touch with you as well, didn't she?
Yes, she did, yeah.
And she said that she really found it really interesting what you've been doing. Anyway, we'll come back to you in a minute. Let's maybe go on to Chris for a bit and see what he has to say. Romain, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Chris, maybe as a general thought, I was wondering how, to what extent you see maybe the world of translation and also interpreting. We've done a bit, just introduction, but differently from last October, from before you entered on the MA.
Chris, you're on mute. It happens to me all the time.
Yes, that's a really good question, Roman. I definitely think I've got a much better understanding of different types of translation and interpreting, and the variety of things that you can go on and do with a master's degree in translation. I think during my undergraduate degree, we'd sort of done lots of literary translation, but not so much in the way of the more professional or technical translations that we've looked at. Medicine and legal in particular. So it's definitely opened my eyes to that side of things. And interpreting was completely new, but I've really enjoyed that. I've got probably even more respect for interpreters than I did have previously. I was certainly guilty of being quite critical of interpreters on the BBC when they're sort of, pausing or can't find the right word, because actually when you're put on the spot, it's really, really difficult to kind of call that knowledge to mind instantaneously, even though you kind of know it's buried in there somewhere. So yeah, it's definitely broadened my perspective on things. And I think that's one of the great things about the Lancaster course, is that it's a very broad-based course, and you do get to experience all the different aspects of translation and interpretation.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I completely get what you're saying about interpreting. Sometimes it can be absolutely frustrating. Like, it's something you know, and you know every day, every time of the week you will say it properly, and then at this very time it's just not happening. You just don't have it, and you're like, what's happening to me? So it's the joys of working on pressure. Maybe if you don't mind, I'm just taking I've seen on the chat a question from Ellison about your dissertation as well. If you can talk a bit more about it, if you're translating from novels, drama, and how do you avoid being influenced, as it were, by existing translations?
Yeah, so I'm translating Genet's third novel called Funeral Rites. It's I wouldn't necessarily, I like the novel. I think it's very interesting. For anybody watching who's taking their first steps into French literature, I'm not sure I'd recommend Genet, because it's quite a difficult text. It's got it's a very kind of dreamlike structure that's quite difficult to follow, and he relies a lot on plays on words. So in terms of taking your first steps into French, I would definitely start with something like L'étranger or Bonjour Tristesse, which are written at a similar time and sort of touch on similar themes. I'm translating the third novel. I've not really been influenced by previous translations. There's only one which I looked at earlier in the year, and it's not a particularly good translation. I think it sort of simplifies the novel. Genet's Funeral Rites is quite. It's been quite heavily criticised because it sort of focuses on the French response to the Second World War in terms of resistance and collaboration. And I think one of the most striking things about the novel is the way Genet sort of explores some of the complexities of that, whereas some of the early criticism has a tendency to, I think, gloss over some of those complexities, and I think that's kind of reflected in the translation. So I'm trying to kind of tease out some of the inconsistencies in the text.
Very interesting. How do you cope with a different context then? Because we're like 60 years on, 70 years on almost now. Do you feel there is, depending on obviously the kind of like target, when translator always have a target audience in mind, do you feel there was some work to be done here at that point?
Definitely, yeah. One of the things I'm trying to do in my translation is demonstrate the ways in which the novel contributes to very modern discussions about, well, discussions about identity. So I am kind of justifying modernizing the text in a way and using much more current turns of phrase because it kind of fits into the overall project. And I feel a sort of justification for doing that. In other circumstances, you would want to stay much more closer to the original in terms of both its language and its context. But in this instance, I'm probably getting a bit more, taking a bit more of an active role than a translator normally might.
Absolutely, the idea of like translator mediator is a very interesting role of that as well. Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I think we'll come back to you in a minute. I'll head back over to you, Sascha.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Chris. There's so many questions coming in, which is absolutely brilliant. We'll try to answer as many as we can, I promise. Amelia, now let's talk to you for a bit. So obviously, I'm really, really interested in machine translation. And you as a professional translator, I mean, you've already hinted at it. You're working with machine translation. You're also working to improve machine translation. So do you feel machine translation is a threat to the profession or to the industry? And I assume you will say no. So could you just explain a bit what you're doing and how that helps the industry?
Yeah, so obviously I'm going to say no. Mostly because a lot of the work that I get is because of machine translation. So if anything, I've got more work through it than just pure translation. And I think language evolves constantly. As linguists, we know that. So the software and the machine translations that we use also need to evolve, and that needs the human input. And that's what I've been doing as a translation annotator, is teaching it slang, teaching it how language works in different contexts. So yeah, you definitely need that human input constantly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think what your story also shows really well is that as a translator, you don't just translate. Not that there's anything wrong with translation itself. It's wonderful and I love it. But there's so many other things translators do and so many other skills you can use. Isn't that right? Yeah,
definitely. So a lot of the things that I've spoke about that I do are kind of translation based. So proofreading, you proofread translations, machine translation, post-editing, that you're post-editing a translation. But I also do a lot of linguistic work that isn't connected to translation, because at the end of the day, I'm a linguist as well as a translator. So I've been doing something that's called linguistic photo reviewing. So reviewing photos that have different languages, like different text in them, and stating what languages they are and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of work out there for translators that isn't translation work.
Great, brilliant. Someone is asking, Amelia, how did you find your current role? So how was the job market when you graduated?
So a lot of perseverance, a lot of unanswered emails, a lot of CVs sent out to all the translation agencies that I could find. So you'd send out a CV to 20 agencies and maybe get one job. And that one job then turns into a recurring client, and then I'm now getting work multiple times a week off that one client. So it really is just perseverance, having a good CV, and just getting in contact with agencies. A lot of people also translate for direct clients. I only translate through translation agencies, as it's just a lot easier to find work that way, but definitely just getting yourself out there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I always say to our students as well, being a freelancer is a lot about building relationships. So a big part of the work is relationship management, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sending that extra email, just introducing yourself, having connections, and then if you have kind of a network of translators, they can also recommend you. So if their client needs, for example, a Spanish translation, but you don't do Spanish, then they can recommend you, and then you're more likely to get that job than if you've been recommended by someone that they already work with. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I think, Romain, you wanted to talk to Amelia about her languages, didn't you?
Yeah, and actually, I will also maybe use one question from the chat from Erin as well. If there is a greater demand from certain languages of others, what I find fascinating with you, Amelia, is that you've done your education with and translating degrees with English and French and Spanish, and yet you also have Norwegian to the side. And I was wondering how you manage now to have a Norwegian input to it, to what extent it's useful for you in your career, being called a rarer language to British, like English, French, and Spanish.
Yeah, so my Norwegian has been a really great asset. So I only translate into English, as that is my main mother tongue, but I do a lot of translation from Norwegian to English, and yeah, there's a greater demand for Norwegian to English translation just because there aren't as many translators. So I've noticed that Norwegian's the language that I translate mostly from, then French, and then lastly Spanish, because there are so many Spanish translators that the market's quite saturated. So having a language that maybe isn't as common would be good for your career.
Okay, great. And the other question I was wondering about is you mentioned the fact that you're working towards developing your kind of like portfolio as developing your specialization, as it were, as medical translator. It's a kind of like a double question: is why this one? Why this field? What makes you choose this one? And how do you develop that? If you could expand a bit on that.
So I'd say I kind of chose this by accident, maybe. So I kind of just got the job and then kind of realized that I really enjoy it. There's so much variety. At the start of my career, I did some legal translation of contracts and stuff like that, which I didn't really find that interesting. So having seen the medical translation side, I found that a lot more interesting. So yeah, I'm trying to specialize in medical translation. And as I said, I'm working as a proofreader. So I proofread medical documents that have already been translated. And that way I get to become familiar with the types of text that this client translates, build up a glossary of terms, and yeah, I learn so much. Every text that I read, I learn about a new disease or a new drug, and then you become interested in it, and then you research it more, and then you just learn every time you translate something. So I think you kind of specialize as you go. It's not something that you can just do straight away, but you kind of do it at the start of your career, and you never really stop specialising, I think.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Very, very interesting. I think it's really interesting to hear all your stories, because you're at very different stages in your career. Lucy as an undergraduate student, then not anymore, almost not anymore. Chris as an MA student, and then Amelia, you as a professional translator who has completed an MA. Now, I've kind of lost track of the chat, I must admit. There are so many really, really interesting questions. And I wonder if it might be time to open up the questions and ask questions to both our students and the academics who gave the presentations at the beginning. Chris Witter, might you be able to take over and ask any questions that haven't been answered yet to both the students and to us? Thank you.
I've got some here that go back to the presentations. In fact, we have so many questions today, a lot more than usual.
It's absolutely brilliant. We'll try to answer as many as we can.
Would you like me to put up the presentation, the slides I'm on? Okay.
Sure.
Let's do that. Okay. It should be coming up now.
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay, so this the first question went all the way back to Erika's presentation. Is translation a way of reproducing a text or of producing a new text? And perhaps perhaps some of the student speakers would like to come in as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and in a way, that's the whole question of thinking about translation. In a way, it's inevitably, of course, a new text, a new thing that you're producing, because you can only repeat the same thing in the same language for it to be entirely same. There is, as I said in conclusion, always some loss and some gain in the sense. Words don't simply match between two languages. We don't speak about the world in the same way in two different languages. And especially when you're talking about literary translation, it's often said that the translator needs to be as skillful with their own language as the author would be, and as creative also with the language as an author would be. So in a way, they often need to reinvent the text in their own language rather than just transposing it. So the degree to which it is an entirely new text or entirely original creation, say, will certainly depend on the nature of the text. The technical text would certainly be much less personalized or singular, or needs much less in terms of recreation, because it's simply an objective language with a scientific terminology often. But when it comes to literature, and I think Sascha mentioned the irony, humor, culture references, and all that, you will need much more of your own invention. So clearly then the translated text will be a recreation. And Ellison put there that article from The Guardian today about the translation of Kafka's first sentence. So that gives a sense of to what extent as a translator you need to, in a way, rewrite the novel in your target language, because simply there isn't a simple, no simple equivalence. So you have to invent your own solution. So, but yeah, that's a great question in any case, and a lot to think about for translation theory and what we prioritize and how.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm a little bit worried about time, but maybe we should skip on to Sophie's question, which could be for Sascha or Erika, maybe. Is machine translation based on equivalence theory, or is there something else that underpins it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very, very complex question, and I'm afraid I can't do it justice in the next 2 minutes or so. So machine translation has evolved a lot over time, and there are sort of roughly 2 different kinds of machine translation: so statistical machine translation and neural machine translation. If you're interested in this, I can recommend some readings later, or just Google it. So is it based on equivalence theory? There are links between equivalence theory and machine translation, definitely, especially with the sort of like older type of machine translation, the statistical one, which is based, and I'm simplifying massively now, which is basically based on the idea that you have an input and an output, and there is some equivalence between these. So if you imagine like a dictionary, if you like. Whereas neuro-machine translation is machine translation that really learns and that is developed based on feedback. And maybe that's something Amelia could talk about a little bit, because that's exactly what Amelia is working with by the sounds of it. Isn't it, Amelia?
Sorry, I was just replying to a question.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just explaining how machine translation has been developing in the past few years, and I was just saying that you are working on improving it, and so could you just explain briefly how that works?
Yeah, so the translation annotation that I do, I basically get a copy of, so I do the annotation for the Norwegian translation, so I get the English source and then the Norwegian translation, and then where there are any issues, I label them, so whether it's a linguistic or a grammatical issue, and then you have to be quite specific with what kind of issue it is. So this is where language learning comes in. So you have to obviously know all the different terms for different aspects of language, and then I annotate it with the specific issue, and that's basically all I do. And honestly, I don't really know what happens behind the scenes, so after I annotate it, that's kind of my job done. I'm guessing that there are software engineers or other people behind the scenes that then kind of teach the machine translation how to not make this mistake again. But yeah, I just do the annotating, so I don't really know what happens after that.
No, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I was trying to mention earlier. That this is this kind of neuro machine translation that tries to move on from equivalence theory, and it's just a bit more complex than that. Yeah, I think that's all really we can say for this question at this point, because it is a very complex topic that we could talk about for a whole year, really.
Okay, bearing that in mind, then I might just move past Lily's question, because I think you've perhaps even touched on that a little bit. And Emily had a really interesting point where she pointed out that pronouns are really difficult with Google Translate, because there are often formal words are preferred over informal words. And you, Sascha, also pointed out the preference for male pronouns. So I was wondering, does this reveal some implicit values or biases encoded in machine translation?
If I could just jump in here before you answer.
Yeah, go on.
So for my dissertation last year, I did a feminist translation focused on feminist translation theory. So this, from a feminist translator standpoint, is a really interesting topic to look at, and it's something that we did discuss during the MA as well. So
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So is there an implicit bias encoded? I mean, I wouldn't want to accuse the programmers of deliberately encoding an implicit bias, but I think it definitely shows that the male or the masculine pronouns are seen as the default option, and which is problematic in itself. I don't know, Erika, do you have any insight into this?
Can I just jump in a second?
Yeah, oh, please do.
I personally feel like, from an English speaker's perspective, where I personally think in German, or particularly in Spanish, the male pronoun is the preferred one, even in the spoken language. If you don't know who you're referring to, you will use the male pronoun in the male form of the verb and the male form of the noun, particularly in Spanish with the verbs. I think it's an implicit bias in the language itself rather than just in the coding. I don't think you can avoid it in the coding very easily, because I think it's part of the so much a part of the language that it would be really difficult for it to not be reflected in machine translation.
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent point, Lucy, and it's a really interesting discussion as well. Yeah, absolutely.
If I can just add the point there, I mean, that's a new question also for an exciting area for discussion in translation theory and studies as well. Because the problem with the machine translation and either the neural or the statistical logics that the machine translation uses is that it amplifies things that are already present in language. So if the male, as you just said, pronoun is more used in the language, then that's what the machine translation will indeed amplify and generalize even more. So that's where things like feminist translation theory or more, emancipatory approaches to translation can try to counterbalance in a way, to at least highlight the fact that this is going on, and you need to be deliberately conscious of it, that this is going on, in order to even see it and not let it be amplified or take over language in a way, because the machines that we are using are constantly reiterating and making it proliferate even further. So just as you don't want certain trends to multiply in society, but then the social media will polarize things, for instance, and reinforce certain trends at the expense of others. If you want the plurality of voices and languages, both in the sense of languages used, discourses used to survive, then we have to somehow counter the tendency of the machines to amplify the strongest. So the strongest become even stronger through the algorithms. That's the problem, and that's why we also need humans.
Great, thank you. And you touched, I think, there on the connection to the next question, which is do you think we will ever get to the point where we don't need human translators?
Good question, big question. What do the students think? And Amelia, Lucy, Chris?
So I touched upon this before, and my answer is obviously no. Just because you do always need the human input. A language evolves constantly. So in order for the technology to evolve, you do need a human input there. So my answer would definitely be no.
I totally agree. I think we might need fewer human translators or humans involved in the process, but I think we will always need somebody. There will always have to be somebody sat there proofreading what's going on, or even telling the people that are coding it that it needs coding in that way. We will always need somebody, like some human involved, I think.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing to keep in mind is that machine translation evolves and gets better, but language changes as well constantly. So there will always be an interrelation between human and machine translators. I'm just a bit conscious of the time. Chris, are there any questions about interpreting that we haven't addressed yet, maybe?
Let's skip forward a little bit. Yep, we definitely do. Cyril had a very interesting question, which Ellison nicely linked to Donald Trump. When you interpret for someone who does not speak very well, for example, jumping from one idea to the next, or does not finish sentences, how do you deal with that as an interpreter? Do you render the lack of logic, or do you try and make it make sense?
Very good question for the field of interpreting. I'm wondering, maybe Chris, from your experience on the MA, if you have any thoughts on that from your little experience this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. If you interpret for somebody who doesn't speak very well, quite how you do that. I mean, one of the key ideas in interpreting is this idea of making sense. So I think to an extent you are justified in making almost whatever adaptations are necessary to get the message across. But at the same time, you do need to balance that with capturing a degree of the speaker's sort of tone, emotion, personality. And it's different to translation as well, because in a way there's less scrutiny or less accountability, because nobody can come back to you later and question what you've done, because unless you've been recorded, there's no record of whether you've made Trump, for example, sound more or less coherent than he actually was. My instinct in the classes was invariably to just try and make it make sense. And as Romain will probably attest, I struggle to keep a straight face when I'm interpreting. So if it doesn't make sense or I disagree with the speaker, I think that was probably obvious, which, while slightly amusing in a class, is probably not a desirable quality in a professional.
Yeah, well, it's, from class practice to professional practice afterwards. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, to be fair. I think you summarized it very, very well, Chris, there. It's really about putting the message across, but at the same time, putting it across in a way that it's been delivered. So if there are, some structural incoherencies in the speech, then they need to be rendered, because that's what the speaker said. If it's just about a linguistic incoherence, the idea is that, if it's not clear for you, it can't be clear for people who are listening to you, and you have to basically work this fine line to get your message, to always communicate, which is really what you're looking for at all times, communication.
Great. Maybe one final question. Do we have
yeah, what about if we just skip to, we had a few questions about pathways into an interpreting career, qualifications, but also how to gain experience. Would anyone like to talk about those issues?
I can definitely talk about experience getting into translation work. So when I first started my MA, I started volunteering for a charity called the INSP, so the International Network of Street Papers. And I worked with them as a volunteer translator. So before I even finished my MA, I had a whole year of translation experience. And they also provide references, feedback. So anyone who's interested, I'd really recommend looking to them, because they're a great charity and also a great way to get experience. Yeah, a lot of places do say that they need 5+ years of experience, but if you can look on websites such as Pros or Translators Cafe, and there you can find a lot of small jobs or perhaps lower paying jobs for the experience, which obviously isn't ideal, but you can get the experience from them. And then also you have, like what I'm doing now with medical translation, is getting experience through proofreading. So I will have the experience as a translation proofreader to be able to then be a medical translator. So there's a lot of different options for getting experience.
And obviously, we'd really recommend the Lancaster MA as a way into translation. It's a really broad-based course. You'll be able to try lots of different types of translation, and there's plenty of support from the department and from the university in terms of gaining the kind of experiences that Amelia's talked about.
We didn't ask them to say that, by the way, and we're not paying them. So thank you very much, Chris. It's really great to hear. I think the only thing I could add is, so if you're interested in a career in interpreting and translation, obviously you need the language skills. So if you are at the stage where you're looking for an undergraduate degree, it's always a good idea to start by doing a languages degree. And if you're interested in combining languages with a different subject, that can be very useful as well, of course. And then in terms of MAs, there's lots of different MA programs in the UK that focus on translation or interpreting, or translation and interpreting. And there's the, what's it called? Chartered Institute of Linguistics, is that what it's called? CIOL as well. I put it in the chat. And they offer Chartered Institute of Linguistics. And they offer qualifications and CPD courses as well in the area of translation and interpreting.
Absolutely, and as much as, you know, for those of you who are still thinking about your options once you leave school, as much as we would love you all to come to Lancaster and to do our master's course, a lot of people, I think, sometimes have second thoughts about languages because they worry that all you can do with it is translation or teaching, but a language degree can open so many doors. I've got friends who have gone on to do such a variety of things. It's really worth looking into the full range of possibilities that taking a language to a higher level can open up.
Fantastic. Well, I think this has been a really, really interesting session. It's been great to see such a fantastic turnout. We had over 80 people, I think, at some point, which is really, really brilliant. As I said, we'll put the recording and the slides on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. Languages and Cultures at Lancaster University. You can connect with us via our other social media channels as well, and you can see them all here. There's a quick questionnaire if you want to give us some feedback on the session or recommend any topics for future sessions. So this was the last one in this series, but that doesn't mean we won't start a new series at some point. We also have open days coming up, and of course these open days in July and June will take place online due to the circumstances for now, and you've got a link there as well. And so please do get in touch if you have any further questions. We are very, very happy to be contacted by you. And we can also forward your queries to our student speakers or to Amelia. So thanks to Erika and Romain for co-leading the session with me, and thanks to Chris for the support throughout the series. Thanks very much to Lucy, Chris, and Amelia. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear from you, and I think you've answered all these questions so brilliantly. It's been really eye-opening for me as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day and stay safe.